Here is something nobody tells you about Scotland. The oldest building in America that people still use was finished around 1610, a small adobe chapel in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Mud walls, rebuilt more than once, no taller than a barn. By the standards of the New World, it is ancient, about as far back as the continuous use of a building goes on that entire continent. And then push open a heavy wooden door in a Scottish village on a Sunday morning. Inside, there are people. Not tour guides, not reenactors, people with car keys in their pockets, singing to the same God, in the same room, on the same spot, where people have been singing for 800, 900, 1,000 years. A box of hymn books by the door, somebody's reading glasses left on a pew, the heating losing its argument with the stone. These are not ruins. When you think of old Scottish churches, you picture roofless walls open to the sky, a turnstile, a gift shop, and most of medieval Scotland really is exactly that, broken and empty. But that is not this list. This list is the other category entirely, the churches where the worship never stopped, or where it stopped, and people fought to start it again and won. Buildings already old when Columbus was a child. When the very first stones of some of these were laid, there was no word, in any language on earth, for the country most of you are watching this from. 10 churches in Scotland, where people still worship this Sunday, ranked from remarkable to genuinely extraordinary. By number 1, the year 1610 is going to feel almost modern. 10. Leuchars, St Athernase Church, Fife. A village best known today for an airbase and the trains that rattle through it to St Andrews, and on a mound in the middle of it, behind a high wall and a steep graveyard, a building that has been called the second finest piece of Norman work in the whole of Great Britain. St Athernase was built in the 1180s. The chancel and the half-round apse at the east end are the originals, nearly 840 years old, and they are still in use because this is a working Church of Scotland parish, not a monument. People are baptised here, married here, buried from here. Ordinary Tuesdays happen here. Look at the outside of that apse. 2 tiers of blind arcading, rows of little stone arches carved into the wall purely for beauty, and a band of carved heads beneath the roofline, oxen, rams, monsters, grinning human faces. And cut into the stone, still visible if you know where to look, the working marks of the masons who shaped these blocks by hand. Some of those exact marks match marks at Durham Cathedral, the same men, or men from the same workshop, leaving their signatures in stone that has outlived every name they ever knew. The dedication is to St Athernase, thought to be a companion of St Columba, the saint we will keep coming back to, all the way to number 1. Hold that thread. Walk in on a grey Fife afternoon. The theatrical stonework of the outside gives way to a plain, sober interior, and your eye is pulled east, through the carved chancel arch, into the apse, where the light gathers. This is where we start. The chain at its most relaxed. It only gets tighter from here. 9. Dalmeny, St Cuthbert's Kirk. 8 miles west of Edinburgh, in the shadow of the Great Forth Bridges, stands what experts will tell you is the most complete Norman parish church in Scotland, one of the most complete in all of Britain. Dalmeny Kirk was built around 1130, more than 800 years of worship, and the congregation still gathers on Sunday mornings. The nave, the chancel, the rounded apse, all of it survives, almost untouched, from the 12th century. And here is the strange part. It survives because nobody could afford to ruin it. Across Scotland, the old churches were destroyed in waves, torn apart at the Reformation, gutted for Presbyterian worship, enlarged as villages grew. Money is what kills old churches. Prosperity is what demolishes them. Dalmeny was too poor for any of it, and when the population grew, it grew in nearby South Queensferry, which split off into its own parish. So Dalmeny was never made bigger, never made grander, never made modern. It was just left to be exactly what it had always been. The masterpiece is the south doorway, a round Norman arch carved with a whole bestiary in stone. Animals, a lamb of God, grotesque heads, the original tool marks still visible on every block. The same mason's marks that tie Leuchars to Durham tie Dalmeny to Dunfermline Abbey, and inside a detail that stops people. The blue-stained glass in the apse was given anonymously in 1942 by a Polish officer stationed nearby in memory of his mother killed when Germany invaded Poland. 800 years of stone and woven into it, the grief of one man in a war the builders could never have dreamed of. That is what a living church is. It keeps absorbing the centuries. Step through that doorway, and the 21st century does not so much recede as fail to arrive. 8. Edinburgh, St Margaret's Chapel, Edinburgh Castle. Now we go to the most visited place on this entire list and find, hidden at the top of it, a secret most of the people queuing past never register. Edinburgh Castle, 2 million visitors a year, the crown jewels, the Great Hall, the 1 o'clock gun, and tucked at the highest point of the rock, in a tiny stone box barely 16 feet long, sits the oldest building in the entire city of Edinburgh, St Margaret's Chapel, built around 1130. It holds maybe 20 people, and it is still used today for weddings, baptisms and services on St Margaret's Day every November. A chapel already nearly 500 years old when that adobe chapel in Santa Fe was being built. King David I built it and named it for his mother, Queen Margaret, an English princess who fled north after the Norman conquest, married a Scottish king, and became so famous for her piety that the Pope later made her a saint, and this is the survivor of survivors. In 1314, Robert the Bruce's men took the castle and, following his scorched earth policy, deliberately demolished almost every building on the rock so the English could never use it again. They tore the fortress apart. They spared exactly one thing, the chapel, and on his deathbed in 1329, the dying Bruce remembered it and set aside money for its repair. But the honesty is part of the story. The chain here broke. After the Reformation, the chapel's purpose was forgotten, and for centuries this sacred room was used as a gunpowder store for the castle garrison. Its very identity was lost until an antiquary rediscovered it in 1845. It was restored, rededicated, brought back to life, and is now cared for by the St Margaret's Chapel Guild, a group whose members all share the name Margaret and who keep fresh flowers inside. So this is not unbroken continuity. It is something almost more moving. A thread that was dropped and lost and then deliberately picked back up. They decided not to leave it lost, a decision that returns in a much bigger way at number 1. 7. Burney, Kirk. 3 miles south of Elgin, in the green country of Moray, there is a small, plain, exceptionally well-built Norman church. From the outside, it is almost humble. Inside, you know instantly you are somewhere very, very old. Burney Kirk was built no later than 1140 on the site of an even older Celtic church, on a spot a Pictish symbol stone in the churchyard suggests was holy long before Christianity reached it. For most of 9 centuries, it has held one of the strongest claims in all of Scotland, the oldest church in continuous use in the country, older than the great abbeys and cathedrals, most of which are now ruins. It even came through the rampage of the Wolf of Badenoch, the royal son who burned Elgin Cathedral to the ground a few miles away. Inside hangs the coronach bell, thought to be over 1,000 years old, and a Bible bound in calfskin with the hair still attached, known locally, with that dry Scots affection, as the Hairy Bible. And here is the hardest thing on this list, because it is happening right now. In November 2023, the Church of Scotland, facing falling congregations, held a final Thanksgiving service at Burney. After almost 900 years, regular Sunday worship by the local Kirk came to an end, and the building is due to be released by 2027. The chain here was about to snap in our own lifetime, except it didn't quite. In January 2024, a small ecumenical group stepped into the silence and began holding worship again. Evening prayer and a monthly mass. Different hands, fewer of them, an uncertain future. But the candles are still being lit in a building that has held human prayer for the better part of a millennium. I am putting Burney here deliberately. It tells you the truth the others let you forget. This continuity is not guaranteed. It is not safe behind glass. It survives only as long as somebody keeps walking through the door. and at Burney that is now happening by the narrowest of margins. 6. Dunkeld Cathedral. On the north bank of the River Tay in Perthshire stands a cathedral that is two buildings at once. The west end is a roofless ruin, vast Gothic arches open to the sky, grass for a floor, clouds for a ceiling. The east end is a warm, working parish church, full of people, with an organist practicing. One building, half dead, half alive, the ruin and the resurrection sharing a single wall. And the reason Dunkeld earns its place is a thread we have been pulling since church number 10. In the year 849, the bones of St Columba were carried off the island of Iona to keep them safe from Viking raids, and brought here by Kenneth MacAlpin, the king who united the Scots and the Picts into the beginnings of Scotland itself. He made Dunkeld the head of the church in his new kingdom, so worship on this spot goes back over 1400 years. A church here since before there was a Scotland to put it in. The cathedral you see was built between the 1260s and 1500, and the choir, still a living church today, is the oldest surviving section. These stones have soaked up some of the most violent history in the country. Behind the high altar lies the armoured stone effigy of the Wolf of Badenoch himself, the king's son who burned Elgin and Forres in a rage and was forced to do public penance in sackcloth and ashes before his own brother the king. And in 1689, after the Jacobite victory at Killiecrankie, a savage street-by-street battle was fought right here, around these walls, and the faint pockmarks of 17th-century musket balls are said to still mark the stone. Stand in the ruined nave at dusk, look up through the empty tracery at the passing sky, then turn east to where the lights are on and the choir is rehearsing. That is the whole of this video in a single view, the part that died and the part beside it that refused to. 5. Kirkwall, St Magnus Cathedral, Orkney. Now we sail north to Orkney, to a building of red and yellow sandstone that locals have called, for 9 centuries, the Light in the North. St Magnus Cathedral was founded in 1137, built when these islands were not Scottish at all, but Norwegian, ruled by Viking earls. It is the most complete medieval cathedral in Scotland, the only one to come through the centuries essentially whole, and it is still an active Church of Scotland congregation with worship every Sunday morning. Set that founding date against America one more time, 1137, 470 years before the English landed at Jamestown. When the Masons laid these first courses, believed to have come straight from building Durham Cathedral, the Norse sagas were still being told aloud by people who believed them. The story at the heart of St Magnus is a Viking story to its bones. Magnus was an Earl of Orkney who shared power with his cousin Hakon. Jealousy curdled into betrayal, and Magnus was martyred on the island of Egilsay. Miracles were reported at his grave, and his nephew Rognvald, to win the earldom and honour his sainted uncle, vowed to build a stone minster grander than anything in Orkney and dedicate it to Magnus. He kept the vow. This entire cathedral is, in effect, a promise made to a dead man, in stone, by his nephew. And the most extraordinary part, the bones are still here. In the 19th and 20th centuries, hidden remains were found concealed inside the great stone pillars of the choir, the relics of Magnus and of Rognvald, sealed into the very columns that hold the roof up. The saint the cathedral is named for, and the man who built it, are not buried beneath it. They are built into it. Every Sunday, the living gather between the pillars, between the bones and the chain holds. 4. Dunfermline Abbey. In Fife, in the old royal town of Dunfermline, there is a church where, during a Sunday service, you are worshipping directly above the bones of the greatest king in Scottish history. There has been a worshipping community on this site since 1072. The present Abbey Church is an active Church of Scotland parish, sitting on the foundations of a great medieval abbey, sacked and broken at the Reformation. The mighty 12th century Romanesque nave still stands, its huge drum pillars carved with chevrons as crisp as the day they were cut, by the same masons whose marks turn up at Durham, at Dalmeny, at Leuchars. This was Scotland's Westminster Abbey. After Iona, no place in the kingdom received more of Scotland's royal dead, But one grave matters more than all the rest, and the story of how it was found is almost unbelievable. In 1818, workmen digging the foundations for the new church uncovered a vault. Inside, a skeleton wrapped in remains of cloth threaded with gold, and the breastbone had been sawn open as if someone had removed the heart. This was Robert the Bruce, the king who won Scotland's independence at Bannockburn, who on his deathbed asked that his heart be cut from his body and carried on crusade. Here he was, lost for 500 years, found by accident under a building site. They reburied him beneath the pulpit of the new church. And when the architect realised what now lay at the heart of his building, he redesigned the tower so that today, carved in giant stone letters around the very top of Dunfermline Abbey against the sky, are the words, King Robert the Bruce. So the congregation gathers and sings and prays on the floor directly above the tomb of the man who made their country a country, his name written across the top of the building in letters you can read from across the town. Worship has carried on here, unbroken in spirit since 1072, right up to this Sunday morning. The king sleeps below, the living sing above. 3. Glasgow Cathedral. Now we come to the great survivor, the one that, by every law of Scottish history, should not exist, and exists because on one day, ordinary working people picked up tools and refused to let it die. Glasgow Cathedral is the oldest building in Glasgow and the oldest cathedral on the Scottish mainland. The church you see dates mostly from the 1200s, but the site is far older. It stands over the tomb of St Mungo, also called Kentigern, the missionary who founded Glasgow and was buried here around the year 614. His tomb is still down in the lower church, the dark, vaulted crypt beneath the choir, one of the most atmospheric spaces in all of Britain, and above it, the cathedral is a living Church of Scotland congregation with worship every Sunday at 11. When the Reformation swept Scotland in 1560, it did not politely reform the old churches. It gutted them, altars stripped, images smashed, roofs torn off for their lead. Across the country, cathedral after cathedral was reduced to a roofless skeleton. Almost none of mainland Scotland's medieval cathedrals survived whole. Glasgow is the exception, the only one on the mainland to come through virtually intact, and the reason is breathtaking in its ordinariness. By the 1570s, the building was in real danger of being torn down, so the trades of the city, the craftsmen, the organised guilds, the men who worked with their hands, took up arms to protect it. In 1579, the Trades House of Glasgow physically defended their cathedral from the people who would have pulled it apart. Not bishops, not kings, tradesmen. That is the truth this whole list keeps circling. These buildings did not survive because the powerful protected them. They survived because, again and again, ordinary people decided they were worth saving. Walk into the dark stone interior, and the medieval might of it sends a chill down your spine. Go down into the lower church, into the forest of squat pillars around St Mungo's tomb, where pilgrims have come for 1400 years. Then come back up, into the light, where the congregation is gathering for the 11 o'clock. Saved once by people who worked with their hands. 2. Whithorn, the cradle. In the deep southwest of Scotland, far down a remote peninsula in Galloway, closer to Belfast than to Glasgow, there is a small, ordinary country town that happens to be where Scottish Christianity began. Not one of the places it began. The place, the cradle. The tradition, recorded by the Venerable Bede over 1,000 years ago, is this. Around the year 397 Dials, while the Roman legions still occupied Britain, a man named Ninian built a church here. A stone church, whitewashed so that it shone, which the people called Candida Casa, the White House. It was the first Christian building in Scotland, the first Christian settlement north of Hadrian's Wall, and it predates the famous island of Iona, the place we're about to finish on Leuchars, by roughly 150 years. Sit with the American comparison here, because this is where it reaches its full, staggering scale. Christian worship began on this spot around 397, 1200 years before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, over 1300 before that adobe chapel rose in Santa Fe. When Ninian whitewashed his little church, the Western Roman Empire had not yet fallen. There was Christian worship in this Galloway field before there was an England, before there was a Scotland. For more than 1,000 years, this was one of the holiest places in the country, a pilgrimage site for kings. Robert the Bruce himself made the journey here, seeking a cure near the end of his life. Now I have to be straight with you, because the truth is part of why this is at number 2 and not number 1. The great medieval priory that grew up over Ninian's church was devastated at the Reformation. Pilgrimage was banned, the shrine destroyed, and much of the priory is a ruin today. But the worship did not end, it moved. Right beside the ruins stands St Ninian's Priory Church, an active Church of Scotland parish, built in 1822 using the stones of the medieval priory itself. The old church was quarried to build the new one. So the very same stones that pilgrims touched for 1,000 years are now the walls inside which the people of Wythorn still gather to worship. This is 1,600 years of Christian worship on a single patch of Scottish earth. The fabric was broken and rebuilt from its own bones. But the chain, the thing this whole list is about, never actually broke. It just changed what it was wearing. 1. Iona Abbey. A tiny island off the west coast of Mull in the Inner Hebrides. You reach it by 2 ferries and a stretch of single-track road and a crossing of bright green water. It is small enough to walk across in an afternoon, and it is, by common agreement, the most sacred place in Scotland, the very birthplace of Christianity in the country, and a thin place, where the distance between heaven and earth feels worn almost to nothing. In the year 563, a man named Columba came here from Ireland with 12 companions and founded a monastery. From this one small island, Christianity spread out across Scotland and down into the north of England. The monks created some of the greatest art of the age. It is widely believed the Book of Kells was made right here. Kings were brought here to be buried. Hold the American comparison up one final time, because nothing makes it land harder than this. 563. There was a working, praying, world-changing community of faith on this rock more than 1,000 years before any permanent European settlement existed anywhere in what is now the United States. When you stand on Iona, the entire history of America is a recent event. But here is the truth of Iona, the perfect truth to end on. The chain broke. The Vikings came, again and again. In 806, 68 monks were massacred in a bay still called Martyrs' Bay. In 825, a monk named Blathmac and those who stayed with him were killed in a raid rather than reveal where Columba's shrine was hidden. The relics were carried away, some to Dunkeld, the very church we visited at number 6. A grander Benedictine abbey rose around 1200 and thrived for centuries. And then the Reformation came in 1560 and monastic life on Iona ended. The buildings fell. For centuries, the worship that had begun in 563 was, on Iona itself, simply over. And then, in 1938, in the middle of the Depression, a Glasgow minister named George MacLeod decided this would not be the end of the story. He gathered a group, craftsmen, trainee ministers, working men, and they began, by hand, to rebuild the ruined abbey, stone by stone, not as a museum, but as a living place of prayer. From that grew the Iona community, which exists to this day, and the restored Abbey Church is now in daily use. Every single day, on the spot where Columba prayed in 563, people gather and worship. So Iona is not unbroken continuity. It is something braver, a chain broken by Vikings and Reformation and 4 centuries of silence, that a group of stubborn people in the 20th century picked up off the ground and joined back together with their bare hands. Walk into the Abbey Church early before the visitors arrive. The stone is restored, but the spirit is ancient. Outside stand the great carved high crosses, more than 1,000 years old, one of them still on the exact spot where it was raised in the 9th century. The same light, the same sea, the same island Columba saw. And inside, every morning, the worship he began nearly 1,500 years ago continues, because someone, in living memory, decided it would. 10 churches, 10 places where this Sunday people will gather and worship on ground older than almost everything standing in America. But the thread connecting them is not what you might expect. It is not that Scotland treasured these places. For most of its history, Scotland did the opposite. The great fact looming over every entry on this list is the Reformation of 1560. It was not gentle. It stripped the altars, smashed the images, pulled the roofs off the cathedrals, and tried, quite deliberately, to erase the entire medieval world of Scottish worship. And it very nearly succeeded. The reason so much of medieval Scotland is roofless ruins today is that the Reformation got to them. These 10 are the exceptions. And look at how they slipped through. Dalmeny survived because the parish was too poor to change it. Glasgow because the city's tradesmen took up arms. St Magnus because in Norse Orkney, the Reformation landed more softly. Iona and St Margaret's Chapel didn't survive at all. They died and were dragged back to life by people who refused to let them stay dead. Whithorn's church was rebuilt from the broken stones of the one before it. None of these places was saved by heritage funding or national pride or a preservation order. They were saved by use, by the simple, fragile, daily fact of someone showing up. That is the whole truth of it. A church does not survive because it is beautiful or old or important. A ruin is all of those. A church survives only as long as somebody keeps coming back. The instant the worship stops, the clock starts running toward the ruin. And if you think that is ancient history, remember Burney, where in 2023, the Sunday worship ended after nearly 900 years. Remember Brechin Cathedral, 800 years old, deconsecrated in 2021. The chain is still breaking, right now. These 10 are not safe. Nothing here is behind glass. They are alive only because this Sunday and next, somebody decides to open the door and sing. The oldest building in America that people still use was finished around 1610. In 10 places in Scotland, that is not even the beginning of the story. It is barely the middle. The past in these churches is not a thing you visit. It is a thing someone is still doing this morning, with the heating struggling and the hymn books out, and the light coming through glass that has been there longer than your country has had a name. If you have ever worshipped in a church older than your own country, or older than any building near you, I want to hear about it. Tell me where and what it felt like to sit inside that much time in the comments. And if this gave you something about Scotland you didn't have before, consider subscribing. We cover the history mainstream content skips, not because it's obscure, but because it asks you to sit with it long enough to understand what it actually means.